Today's webinar is on WIOA Unified State Plan modifications that are necessary. This is primarily intended for the State Workforce Board and those groups that have been assigned specific areas of the plan to be modified. We appreciate others joining, but it may not, quite relate to you because you don't have a particular assignment to those revisions. But certainly we appreciate you joining us and listening to what the plan is going to have included in it through these modifications. On the left-hand side, you see the chat pod. As Chelsea said in the chat pod, we are going to leave the phone lines open. We're going to give a couple opportunities for everyone to comment or ask questions over the telephone. So to save a little bit of difficulty in bouncing back and forth from muting and unmuting multiple lines, we'll just go ahead and leave them open. Please, if you're not intending to speak or ask questions or during a period of time of silence for yourself, mute your phone so we don't get any background noise. Do not put those on hold. If you have to take a call, you'll either have to let it go to voicemail or you'll have to sign off of this call and take that call. Otherwise, it could create noise issues in the background. In the bottom left-hand corner is the Files To pod, which you can get all of the documents that were shared with you previously today in an email. We will be utilizing the PowerPoint only. The others are for informational purposes, provide more detail as you read through this PowerPoint and listen to our discussions. There's one additional document that you may not have received. It's called the sign-in or sign-up sheet. For those that have a place for providing information to the modifications, that'll give you a means to go in there and see what's being modified. If you are someone assigned as the point person to make those modifications, you'll have further access. If you're on neither of those groups, you will not have access to that as a secured site. So if you don't know if you're on one of those groups, probably an indication you're not on one of those groups because you should have got this information. Other than the board, I'll resend that information to all of our board members to ensure you have proper authorization to get in and look at these documents. As I mentioned, we're going to be utilizing the PowerPoint in front of you. I've also got with us today Christy Jones from Kerbereck and Breckel, who is going to assist in presentation. She's been involved in the original documentation and efforts to develop the original 2016 Unified Plan and is also lead staff to these modifications. So with that housekeeping behind us, welcome everyone. Happy New Year. Appreciate all of you joining us. We've had a lot going on over the last few months from the new IWIB strategic plan that was approved in December. We've had some opportunities for local areas and other stakeholders to seek out additional funding to support special initiatives and populations. I know the Community College Board has developed one strategic plan and are in the process of developing another. And we've got a couple different policy work groups going on. So there's a lot going on. This, though, really takes priority right now because there's such a short timeline, as you'll see as we get further into the slides. It's a very short turnaround for us here in Illinois and all the other states. So we've got to keep a focused process and plan in front of us. These webinars are to help assist in allowing all of those individuals that are a part of the process to see what's going on, to provide their input, to be a part of the consultation process, and to finally get a review and approval before we submit these to the Departments of Labor and Education. Series of 4 webinars. We'll give you those other dates if you don't already have those, as well as the times for those additional 3 webinars. And those will just kind of go along in the process, continuing to update everybody as we go along. So with that, I'd like to introduce Christy Jones from KEB, who will cover the first third or so of our presentation.
Thank you, Mark. Good afternoon, everyone. Christy Jones from KEB. To get started, I am going to give an overview of the Unified State Plan. Then I'm going to go over the process that the Unified State Plan work group prepared to identify modifications to the Unified State Plan. I'm going to give some background on how the Unified State Plan was structured in terms of strategic versus operational elements. Talk about the identification of responsibilities and assignments for work group and subgroup members. And then I'll go over a timeline that the work group developed. As you'll see, this is a fairly large PowerPoint. I believe there's about 30 slides. So there's quite a bit of information on each slide that we want you to have as reference material. But because we want to be respectful of your time today and the hour that we have, we'll focus on the highlights of each slide. And if you could mute your phone if it's not muted, that would be greatly appreciated. There's some feedback. Okay, so the requirements for the state plan. The WIOA Federal Act under WIOA Section 102 describes requirements for the Unified State Plan. Under the WIOA statute, states are required to submit a plan to be eligible to receive allotments of the 6 core programs. States are given the option to submit a unified state plan or a combined state plan. And in a later slide, I'll talk about the difference between the two and why the state of Illinois made the initial decision for the first submission under WIOA to submit a unified state plan. The Unified State Plan and the modification require approval by both the Secretary of Labor and the Secretary of Education. The initial submission of the Unified State Plan, which was submitted in 2016, outlines a 4-year strategy for the state, and it's good through the year of 2020. Okay, so Section 102C3 specifically talks about modifications that are required at the end of the first 2-year period of the Unified State Plan. Those modification requirements that are actually written in the Act are very brief and specific. They say that you are required to update changes in labor market and economic conditions, and then changes in other factors affecting the implementation of the Unified State Plan. Some of you may have heard this at the last IWIB meeting, but originally the modification submission date was June 30th of 2018 based on this requirement under the Federal Act and some other written guidance that we received. However, since then we've received informal guidance from DOL Region 5 stating that the modification submission will be due on April 1st of 2018. And since that time, other informal guidance has told us that the modification submission will be due in mid-March. We still have not received any formal guidance, so DOL Region 5 has told us to proceed as though there's a mid-March modification date. And I'll talk about this a little later on in the presentation, but there also has not been any new guidance or guidance document for the Unified State Plan modification. So Region 5 suggested that the best course of action is to follow the guidance that was put out for the initial submission of the Unified State Plan. And with all these changes, the Unified State Plan Work Group has been very flexible and has now in place a work plan that goes along with the anticipated March 15th submission date. I do want to note there is a required public comment period prior to submission of modifications. We do know to date there's not a defined public comment period. However, the work group will use good judgment in making sure there is a public comment period and that everyone gets an opportunity across the state to review modifications to the Unified State Plan. The one other thing I wanted to note is outside of statute, the work group will also update the plan based upon any newly issued federal regulations and additional guidance that has been issued by DOL. So requirements for the state plan. The state board shall assist the governor in the development, implementation, and modification and approve the prior to submission by the governor. Regional and local plans must be aligned to the strategy described in the plan. That's something that I really wanted to highlight today because in the initial submission, this level of detail was not included because regional and local plans were not complete. So the modification will include best practices and examples from regional and local plans per the review subgroup to demonstrate a statewide integrated approach. As I mentioned earlier, and I'll talk about in the next slide, Illinois chose to submit a unified state plan. The plan is comprised of strategic and operational elements, and a little later on, I'll talk about the required structure for unified state plan and unified state plan modification submittal. And then there's also a final section to the plan, and that's program-specific requirements that are required for core partner programs. So there's a Title I specific plan, there's a Title II plan, there's a Title III plan that is very short and concise in comparison to the other plans, and then there's a Title IV plan. So we'll work closely with our core program partner representatives to complete those plans or components of the plan. They are very specific to those programs. So in regard to the difference between a unified versus combined state plan, a unified state plan requires all 6 core formula grant programs, and you'll see those listed on the slide in front of you today. A combined state plan requires all 6 core formula grant programs, plus you make a selection, the state actually makes a selection of one of 11 additional partner programs included among the other 6 core formula grant programs, and there's a list there of some examples. So for the 2016 submission, the state submitted a unified state plan, as you're aware. Since this was the initial submission under WIOA, the state wanted to submit the strongest version of a plan. And that being said, required partners were not excluded from the plan development process. So if you go in and you look at the initial submission of the Unified State Plan, you'll see several examples from CTE or veterans or TANF, just to name a few. So even though it was a Unified State Plan, the work group felt it was important to also include examples from required partners across the state. So strategic elements, as I mentioned before, there's strategic and operational elements of the plan. To give you a little bit of background without going into too much detail today, the structure of the Unified State Plan is actually laid out by the federal government. Under WIA, there was a lot more flexibility, but under WIOA, there was actually put out an ICR, which is an acronym for Information Collection Request. That was federal guidance that came out in February of 2016. And what it is it goes through section by section of the Unified State Plan. It's actually written in a question and answer format. And ultimately, the state has to submit their answers in that format. So when we put together the plan, we then have to put our, what I'll call answers, into an official Department of Labor and Department of Education federal portal. So there's not any flexibility on how we format the plan. And as I want to mention just one more time, this is joint guidance, so it's DOL and DOE, Department of Education guidance. So specifically on the strategic elements, it looks at analyses of the following, and these are up on the screen. The state's economic conditions, workforce characteristics, workforce development activities, state vision, goals for the workforce development system, alignment strategies for workforce development programs, support economic growth, and successful strategies for aligning workforce development programs to support economic growth. This section is heavily data-driven, and I don't want to go into a high level of detail, but for the modification, we'll be using 2016 data, and that's the most current information available to the state in order to make the submission by March 15th. Okay, next we have what I'll call Section 2, or the operational elements. Those are up in front of you on the screen as well. The identification of efforts to support the strategic visions and goals at the state level to ensure the state can meet its strategic goals, implement its alignment strategy, and support ongoing program development and coordination through necessary infrastructure, policies, and activities. And Mark put together a really nice graphic that's on the screen, and that ties back to the IWIB guiding principles. I also should mention under operational elements fall the state board functions and activities. For the operational planning elements, there's several items including state strategy implementation and state operating systems and policies. The plans must identify specific strategies for coordinating programs and services for target populations. This was a key element in the initial submission of the Unified State Plan. DOL and DOE expressed to us that you really need, all states need to key in on target populations. So that's something we'll also look at very closely with the modification of the plan. Some other areas under operational planning elements are the assessment and evaluations of programs and one-step program partners, distribution of funds for core programs, program data, priority of service for veterans, and accessibility. As I mentioned previously, there are a few additional elements to the plan, and those are assurances and then the program-specific responses. So now I'm going to turn it back over to Mark Burgess, who's going to talk about the IWIB strategic plan in relation to the Unified State Plan modification.
Thanks, Christy. Back in December, the IWIB did vote on their strategic plan that they've been developing for over a year and approved that unanimously. Within that plan, there are 5 primary objectives you'll see here that were developed through 4 goal teams focused on business engagement, customer-centered design, technology, and board effectiveness. They just wanted to make sure that these objectives were clear and nice, and so they started out with quite a few objectives and came up with these 5 in the end to really focus their attention on what was important to them over the next 2 to 3 years as they implement that plan. There's really a 2-part discussion here. We want to cover the strategic plan, but not a lot of details. This webinar isn't about the strategic plan. It just is an opportunity to show how their strategic plan and the state's unified plan will be in cohesive fashion as far as the information. So we want to cover some of that in a little detail, but not total detail. The IWIB strategic plan framework looks at the specific asks under the strategic and operational elements. We want to spend a little bit of time on these and identify that there are 17 priority activities and how those each might align with the elements of the unified plan. As I said, you'll see here there are 5 primary objectives, and then we'll further break those down over the next few slides without going into the detail, where the first objective is focusing on the business side of it, where the business engagement goal team came up with 6 priority activities, including such things as administrative data. So as Christy said, the strategic elements are really data-driven with a narrative to provide additional information. You'll see that data starts here in this area. 1.4 talks about key industry sectors, so it's pretty evident that we want to provide them as up-to-date of information as possible when we provide these modifications and submit them. The next section of their strategic plan focused on the OneStop System, specifically addressing the needs of customers as well as fostering collaboration, cooperative efforts between all of the system partners, stakeholders, and the agencies that are a part of the WIOA Act and requirements. You'll want to note the references here to each activity on all these 3 pages that I'm covering, such as 2.1, 2.2, 2.3, fostering cooperation, because when we get into the details of what's required in the Unified Plan, we'll reference those so you can see where those connections are at. The third objective was the data-driven group that came up with a couple main priority activities, which is ensuring technology is available to provide the data and provide the reporting requirements under WIOA, and to ensure we're capturing, maintaining, and utilizing the data flows to best serve our customers, both individuals and businesses. The fourth objective and the fifth objective both relate to the board effectiveness goal team. The first objective specifically relates to board members, both at the state and local level, ensuring they have the information necessary to do and comply with the function requirements of the Act, ensure we're going to be providing the training and outreach necessary, and ensuring that we, as a board, are making the connections between the state and local efforts so that we can all maximize the funding and all of the staffing and that we have. The fifth objective is really looking at themselves as a board and saying we want to hold ourselves accountable by ensuring that we lead with authenticity, but also ensuring that we have active members, that we are provided an understanding of the objectives, making decisions and tracking progress to advance the boards and their meetings. So we'll see now we'll get into more specifics of the Unified Plan modification requirements. Christy provided just a little bit of an overview, but we want to get into more of the detail without going into too much detail. You'll see several groups there. I think there's about 10 of them that have some assignment level into responding to the requirements of the modifications. 3 of those relate to the board. There are some to data, a couple of them. There are some to specific initiatives, and several of those that actually start at the governor's level when you talk about the P20 Council. Illinois Pathways is something that all the system, workforce and economic development and education, all have a piece in, and they're currently going through the process of defining the pathways and actually approving those. The state board, the IWIB, approved a portion of that at their meeting in December, and I think there's 1 or 2 more groups that still have to review that and provide approval so that there's a consistent message across the state and across all of our agency partners and our stakeholders throughout Illinois and throughout the systems. Of note here are the points of contact. If you are part of one of these groups and are not a point of contact, any information, any comments, any questions, any additions to the current Unified Plan that you might want to make should go through that point of contact. This allows us to keep as few of hands, if you will, out of the actual documents as possible, yet get the information from multiple sources, put it into a cohesive message, and enter it into the actual document as it's being prepared to submit to DOL and Department of Education. I'm sorry. So again, if you're not on one of these groups and you've joined us today, or you get through discussions, the message of today's webinar, you should contact somebody on one of these points of contact that you're associated with and get them your information. So let's go into some of the specifics. Again, as Christy said, we don't have the time, nor should we really spend today's webinar going through each and every one of these elements. There's several dozen of them, but we want to highlight a few of them and just kind of show you how this is laid out. There's about 10 or 11 slides of this, so again, we would overbear you with information today. The first few items, as you see, are strategic elements. They're highly data-driven in the first page. So you'll see the assignments are to a data team that is comprised of core agency partners as well as IWIB members and other data individuals. They're staffed by either agency partners, the IWIB, or consultants that have been contracted to assist with these groups. As you'll see also, there are submission dates for each of the activities or elements, some of these coming up very quickly. So on this page alone, you'll see that there's a lot of information that has to be gathered. Much of it's already been gathered. The narrative to this data needs to be put together into the documents and be prepared for submission on January 12th. Not much time for those. So those have all been ongoing at this time. You'll see to the far right where some of the priority activities of the IWIB strategic plan can be identified. Again, you'll see from section or objective 1 and objective 3 are highly covered in these areas because they're data-driven, they're business information, they're key strategy or key sector information, labor market trends, et cetera. So that's how these slides are laid out. If you've got any questions, and before we move further into this detail, we didn't give you an opportunity. Does anyone have any questions of the general overlay of the modification, the process so far, before we get into more specific elements? I haven't seen any on the chat pod, but anyone on the telephone want to provide any comments or have any questions at this time? Okay, with no questions, we'll move on to the next area, which still is strategic elements, but we get into more detail. The narrative will start looking a little different because it's more narrative-based as opposed to data-driven. But we also find in the second section here where we really start tying the IWIB's focus for the state of Illinois to how the unified plan will get laid out. We want to make sure that there's a cohesive message there, that the state board, as they're developing their strategic plan, as they're implementing it, as they're deciding and identifying particular strategic elements, that we tie those into the unified plan. So there'll be a lot of work between in discussions between board members, state agency partners, and how that message is going to be conveyed in the final product. In the next area, we get even more specifics on describing the strategies that the state will implement, including industry or sector partnerships. So we really get into the down and dirty part of how Illinois is going to comply with the requirements of WIOA. How is it implementing these things, and what's different from the original unified plan that was submitted in 2016? That's really how our teams are looking at this. Is there's three parts. What's happened in the last 2 years? Did we succeed in all the areas we said we would succeed in the first couple of years? If not, what were some of the conflicts, maybe some of the concerns that we have to address going forward? We need to outline those. What do we have going on in today's world of workforce, education, and economic development that we need to document in the modifications? And then finally, looking forward, what is it we're looking to do in the next 2 years? So we've got new messages that can be crafted in every single area based on those three criteria of what DOL and Department of Education are expecting. Even though we haven't got formal guidance, we have heard from them informally that they will be looking at those three kind of hierarchy or I guess timelines of what's happened, what is happening, and what's going to happen. We move from the strategic elements into the operational elements. There's a lot more requirements here in this section than there were previously. Much of this focuses in this area on all of the core partners. So you'll see under the assignments names that are tied to each of the 4 core partners, which cover 6 core programs. They will be the identified individuals that will be covering those, but some of these relate to the state board, so we'll be ensuring that we have that covered as well. And then again, you'll see that the submission dates have gone a little bit further out. We've got about a month to start submitting some of these elements for final review and input into the final documents. Also under the operational elements, we have state strategy implementation. So how are we improving access to post-secondary credentials, and how are we coordinating economic development strategy? So that brings into the other two elements of what we call the world of workforce education and economic development. We need to make sure we're addressing all three of those in our unified plan. Under the state operating systems and policies, what policies is the state under the direction of the board developing that address all of the needs of the act itself, specifically some of the guidance that we've received in the past, and we'll have to be mindful of any guidance we receive in the next few weeks leading up to our submission. You'll see these really address almost all of the assigned areas, some of these with quite a few that have input to these. Some we get into more initiative-based and start talking about interagency work group. We also talk about work of the P20 Council and the Workforce Readiness and Apprenticeship Program. We've got additional state program and state board overview. There is a full section in the act, in the plan, requiring each of those programs to give an overview of their efforts specifically. So in this area, it's not as designed to be where all of the partners are in one clear message. However, we understand that each partner should be tying their efforts to those of the other partners of the state board and of other stakeholders as they craft that message. We'll make sure that we get them our state board information. We've got a great group right now, and so we want to make sure we announce to Region 5 who those people are. Moving on to the next slide, we have assessment and evaluation of programs and the one-stop partner. So there'll be some policies that have to be reviewed that address these areas. We need to look at the assessments that have occurred in the past couple of years. What are the results of those assessments? One specific one that can be mentioned is the one-stop certification process that began, about July or so, was submitted by July 1st of last year, 2017. And we are beginning the process of reviewing that policy for any updates based on best practices that the local boards may have implemented as they entered their certification process and planning efforts. We'll want to make sure that we look at all the evaluations that have occurred, look at some data from those, but also we need to look at what evaluations and assessments we aren't doing as a state that maybe we should be doing. So the board, through their evaluation and accountability committee, through all of the core partners, we want to look and see what we should be doing as a state going forward. What evaluations, what assessments, what criteria should be considered so that we are addressing one of the key factors of WIOA, which is continuous improvement. The board is highly focused on that when they were developing their strategic plan. That was brought up a number of occasions to ensure that what they're doing going forward with their plan is ensuring the state moves forward. Where we have a deficiency, we address it. Where we have a hurdle, we overcome it as best as we can. We have a section here at the bottom talking about the funding for each of the programs, and so they'll have to cover those in detail to show where the funds are going, how they're going to address specific initiatives and programs in general. Also under operational elements are more program data. So we get back to, even though these aren't under the strategic elements, which we thought were and indicated were really data-driven, we get back into data. We want to make sure that the systems are aligned, that we're getting data that matches up, that we're comparing apples to apples, oranges to oranges, and that we're not just submitting multiple sets of data that have no connection made. And so the narrative will really have to do that, where we don't have an integrated system at this time. Illinois is working towards that through the Department of Innovation and Technology. But until we get to that point, we will have to make sure that Illinois outlines in their plan how they're going to make the connections between all of that data and the multiple systems that currently exist. All right, next we continue on with that same area, but we talk about more specifics that you'll see here where we want to make sure we're addressing priority populations, including veterans, individuals with disabilities, youth, English language learners, and making sure we're addressing them because we know they're a priority based on the data that we have, both at the state, regional, and state and regional and local levels. That's one thing, that we want to make sure this plan does better than it did the first time around is just make sure we're getting data out to the people that have to make decisions, and that means the state board and the local boards. Make sure they have that current data and they're making those decisions based on that data, and they're serving the proper populations in the right way. I mentioned the service integration policy work group earlier as one that's developing policy, and that one will really have a big part in this to identify who our customers are, identify their needs, and make sure that the system is developed going forward to address those needs. Finally, we have to address the coordination with the state plan programs. We want to, need to describe the methods used for joint planning and coordination among all of our core partners, back to the coordinated effort that WIOA speaks to highly. Illinois has a ways to go. We admit that, but we are working towards that. And I think all of the efforts around strategic planning, the coordinated efforts under the interagency work group, and all the partner programs coming together to discuss those, I think those are all going to play a big part in getting a much more coordinated system here in Illinois. All right, are there any questions after we went through that? I know we didn't go through much detail, but the documents that you see in the files pod or the ones that you received by email will provide a little more detail to all of those elements. That's why we didn't really want to go into too much of it this time. As we go forward with additional webinars, and Christy will speak to those here in a moment, we will start focusing more on each of those elements and what needs to be addressed in those areas as the modifications are made. So Christy, without any further questions, go ahead and turn it back over to you.
Thanks, Mark. So just to give an overview, I guess taking a couple steps back for just November and December, quite a bit of work has been done by the work group. What Mark just took you through is just one component of the Unified State Plan work group work plan. In mid-December, the entire work group actually met in person. It was something that was suggested by the initial Unified State Plan developers that we needed to block some time where everyone could talk, actually go through the ICR or the federal guidance section by section and have a discussion of should this section be modified. So we did that in mid-December in order to develop the work plan that Mark just led you through. So I'm going to go through January, February, and March and pick out some of the highlights. Just to let you know, the work group meets bi-weekly via conference call. There is a call that's led by Chairman Rico, just giving everyone a chance to provide any updates, ask questions, and then we usually have one or two specific areas that we talk about during each of those bi-weekly calls. So for the month of January, it's really about strategic elements. The draft updates of the strategic elements are due January 12th. And then at the end of the month, during the biweekly call, we as a work group will approve the initial draft of strategic elements of the plan. Moving on to February, it shifts. The work group will focus on operational elements. So early in the month, on February 9th, the draft updates of the operational elements of the plan are due. At the end of the month, during the biweekly call, the work group will approve the initial draft of the operational elements. Then they will also, the partner-specific sections, so that third component that I talked about, where each of the titles are required to submit their information, that will be finalized. And then at the end of the month, there will be an IWIB Executive Committee briefing. In March, we anticipate required submittal of the Unified State Plan modification. So on the beginning of the month, release of additional plan requirements from the U.S. Departments of Labor and Education. We know that that's a projected time frame. We don't have any final information, but if we do receive additional guidance, our intention when we set up the work plan was to have all of our strategic and operational elements based on the guidance that we have finalized, so that if there is new guidance, we'll have that window to answer those questions. And as I mentioned, that anticipated due date of March 15th is written in there. I wanted to pull out the slide in front of you. These were written in the January, February, and March slides, but I want to draw your attention to the 4-part webinar series where we're in part 1 today. The Thursday, January 25th, the second webinar, we do now have a time. It will be from 12:30 to 1:30. So please put these 4 webinars on your calendar. We hope that if you're joining us today, you'll stay a part of it for all 4 webinars as we progress through the cycle of the modification process. I want to point out that when we wrap up the modification, we'll go through a debriefing process. We did that with the initial submission of the Unified State Plan, and it was very successful. There's quite a bit we learned because that was the first submission under WIOA. So we'll do the same thing with the modification. And as soon as that debriefing process ends, the work group will start a timeline for the development of the 2020 submission, and that is actually a full plan submission. So when the 2016 plan expires in 2020, the state will be required to submit a new comprehensive unified state plan. And the last slide has my contact information as well as Mark Burgess's contact information. I want to open it up for questions again. I know this is a lot of information. We're going to make sure that this PowerPoint presentation is available to you. Chelsea just let me know that the PowerPoint is the file pod second from the bottom in the files that you can see on your screen right now. So that is available to you. But please let us know right now if you have any questions. We'll make sure the phone lines are unmuted, or you can type into the chat pod.
Thanks, Christy. I want to follow up on one of your last comments there on that slide before, where the state should begin the process of developing that 2020 plan immediately, because really as we continue going forward under these new modifications once they're submitted, we'll need to be thinking about how they're affecting the system, what changes need to be made, and there's no real need, or I'm sorry, no reason to wait until mid-2019 or late 2019 to start thinking and discussing those. So we'll be asking the board and also should be asking all of our agency partners who are part of development of a new plan in 2020 to, as they complete any of their activities under WIOA and plan forward, that those things are considered and documented. And then when we get to the point of actually putting the 2020 together, we'll have a lot of that information already gathered, and it won't seem so rushed as we've come to this time around. We'll have to utilize old guidance until they give us new guidance again, but the point being that we want to make sure we're forward thinking. It was certainly addressed at the IWEB meeting in December that we should be considering a process of this nature, and so that's why we added that to that slide, is to ensure everybody is on board to begin the process immediately after this submission. And like you said, maybe wait at least after we do a little debriefing, see where we can make some improvements to the process and begin that process going forward. So again, thank you on your part, Christy. Did anyone have any comments or questions to the information today? For those of you that are on any of these work groups, you'll be hearing from your lead as to the next steps. You'll be getting information from Christy or your lead to the next webinars if you haven't already received those. I think Christy may have sent those out to some of the individuals. I'll be sending those out for the state board members to get on their calendar. But hopefully we'll be able to continue to provide you this opportunity to hear the changes, hear the modifications, the information that is being considered to be put into those changes, and provide any feedback and comments prior to the need to submit it. This kind of fell in line with the strategic plan for the IWIB, where we held webinars ahead of their final review and approval. It worked very well, and so as long and as often as we can use a process where we use webinars to provide that information to the system, we're going to continue to do that. Sometimes it will happen outside of the WIOA Wednesday webinar series, just because it's more focused on a particular topic such as this is. Sometimes we'll utilize those WIOA Wednesday webinars for such purposes as well. So hopefully you found this informative, and if anyone has any questions beyond today's webinar, please reach out to your contact individual with your work group. If you're unsure about that, contact your administrator of your program and see they should be able to direct you to the right individual who's the point of contact for the agency or the board. Thank you very much, and we look forward to seeing you on January 25th